switched on. I'm putting it on now. Sorry, Natalia, we've missed the introduction, but that's okay. So Natalia is going to get started on the story of this paper, and hopefully we have a great discussion afterwards. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. And for those of you who haven't seen it, Stephanie also started a reading club on OHN on Substack, and she wrote this very nice review of the paper. So if you want to not just see the paper, but also see what smart people who are real historians think about it, I recommend that. Um, so yes, thank you for joining us. I will talk about publishing in management journals because that seems to be the topic of interest. And before I do, I just kind of want to start with this question, which is, why publish your work in the first place, right? Why go through this process? And the reason, like, why engage in academic publishing? And I just want to be very clear that, there are things that are not going to happen to you as a result of this, most likely, right? Uh, you're not going to get rich. You're not going to get famous again, most likely. And publishing history in management journals is not the way to get tenure quickly, right? So I just want to get all those out of the way, right? That's not why we do this. And I think having a good answer to the question why we do this is really helpful as you go through the process, as you face rejection, as you kind of think again. And so I'm gonna show you a picture which represents what the answer to that question is for me. And by preview of coming attractions, Rohin Borpujari will be joining this group on March 3rd. And, for him, the answer to that question is, how the hell did the Manhattan Project succeed while preserving secrecy, right? For me, it's if you ask me to explain what I've done with the past 15 years of my life, it boils down to this picture, and this picture really bothers me. And what's on this chart, and my axes are conveniently not labeled, but what's on this chart is a percentage of US mortgages in foreclosure, residential mortgages in the US in foreclosure. And so the blip on the left is the Great Depression. Then we have some breaks in the data, but essentially what I've done for the past 15 years is try to arrive at an explanation of the link between the introduction of mortgage-backed securities in the US in 1968 and the 2008 mortgage crisis, right? Again, we can talk about the wisdom of spending 15 years of your life unpacking one picture or trying to convince other people of what that picture is. But I think, like, at the end of the day, you publish what gets you to publish in academic journals is that something really bothers you, right? And bothers you for a long time, and it's sufficiently complicated that there is this puzzle that you found, and you're trying different keys, right? So that's how I think about academic publishing. And you feel an obligation to share it with the world because this puzzle is important, right? Like, it really matters that 3 million people lost their homes, right? It really matters that this, like, nobody noticed that there was this connection. Okay. So with that, when I say 15 years, what do I mean? So I finished my dissertation in 2012 with this lovely title of the 2008 mortgage crisis as a failure of analogical reasoning. And then it took me 6 years to publish my first paper in Enterprise and Society, which is kind of one of the top business history journals. And then in 2019, so 7 years later, I published two papers, one in SMJ and one in business history. And then I published a book chapter in the Routledge Companion to Anthropology and Management, which talked about kind of an expansive view of the history of these markets. And finally, in 2025, I published this SMJ, which will be either the last or the second to last paper based on these, right? And so And now that I've walked you through what I've been doing, I want to take a reductive view, right? Like I would call it like a business school dean view of this project. And this project would look like this, right? All that matters are the two SMJs, everything else, nice. But, like for 13 years, you have two papers out of this project, right? And the reason I want to be clear about this reductive view, right? And I want to talk about why the other work is important and how publishing in history journals really helps you figure out the management piece of it, right? And so I will now take another lens of this journey. Let's now focusing on the journey towards the 2025 paper. And look, I have my dissertation from 2012. And then February 2021, hooray, I get this R&R from SMJ on this paper, which at the time was titled When Analogies Backfire, the Case of Analogical Lock-in. So, somebody might say, oh, hooray, it took you, 9 years to figure out this framing, except for in 2014, I got the lovely rejection from ASQ, and all of ASQ rejections are lovely. On a paper which had this language, analogical lock-in, the case of analogical lock-in in the title. And you could say, okay, so the difference must have been that SMJ gave you an R&R and told you to rewrite this paper as a categories paper, which is what it became, right? So in February 24, I get this conditional accept, hooray, hooray. Except for in the case of my ASQ rejection, I also kind of talked the editor into giving me effectively a reject and resubmit. And I resubmitted it as this paper called Negotiating Market Boundaries, Fitting New Products into Existing Categories, right? So this framing of fitting things into existing categories, right, is also not new to me. So the question is, right, why was one of these things not a paper in management journals and the other thing a paper, right? And as you think about academic publishing, and I think most of us, right, are here because no one teaches us how to publish, right? We kind of are expected to learn that on our own. And I was thinking of this like, as one of these game shows. I don't know what's in these days. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire used to be a show, and you had like lifelines, right? And the lifelines, if you don't know what you're doing in our profession, is to present wherever you can, right? Present your work. Anybody who invites you, go there. So one of the kind of interesting settings I was invited to was I got an invitation at the time I was an assistant professor at the Wharton School to go present my work at the Duke Strategy Conference. And when I first got that invitation, I was honestly thinking it was a case of mistaken identity because none of those people do any qualitative work, never mind historical work whatsoever. But I said yes, and I went. The second lifeline, if you want to publish in management journals, is it really helps to have a template, right? Like who else has written something that's like this thing that I'm doing, and then I'm going to use it as a template. And the third piece that took me entirely too long to figure out is to co-author, right? So maybe my second ASQ rejection would have had a different outcome if I had enlisted a co-author who's familiar with the process. Because I think the way to think about publishing in academic journals is as a craft, right? You can read all the books you want about how to publish in academic journals, just like you could read all the books you want about knitting. But to learn how to actually do it, there are so many unspoken norms that having a co-author who knows what they're doing is really helpful, which is something that took me a while to figure out and to find co-authors, right? So in my particular case, I relied heavily on item 1, which is present wherever you can and get feedback from as many people as possible. So at that Duke conference I told you about, Ashish Arora has told me, you actually have 2 papers. So when you were saying you're presenting your job market paper, you have two papers. So for all of you starting out, this is kind of an important piece that you don't know how narrow an academic paper has to be. And oftentimes when people present, especially early work, they may have 1, 2, 7, 18 papers in their paper. And this is especially true with historical work because the context is so rich and you could take it in so many different directions that I think as a historian, it's hard to prioritize which of these things is a paper and how many do I have in there. This is a piece of advice I got from Matthias Kipping, who is fabulous. And this is a challenge I was having that's related to the first challenge, which is there is all this rich context, right? Like as a historian, you learn about this context and every detail is fascinating. And there are so many different nuggets, right? And what this runs into in publishing in management journals is you have 7, maybe 10 pages total for your findings, right? And I remember having this conversation with Mary Tripsos, who at the time was an editor at Organization Science, and I was going to send whatever that paper was to her. And I said to her, but Mary, what do I do with like 40 pages of history, right? Which I need to make my argument. And Mary said to me, oh, you put that in the appendix. And so for me, what was lovely about Matthias's advice, right, is I didn't want to put it in the appendix. I thought the history was A, interesting in its own right, B, something I wanted to get feedback on, right? And C, I wanted to be challenged to make sure that I had my facts right, right? I wanted somebody who was interested in the evidence to contest it for, right? And so this feedback from Felipe Chasser at Michigan I got because when I was presenting still that ASQ categories framing at a workshop in Michigan, for 45 pages, for 45 minutes, I was stuck on my first slide because one of Felipe's colleagues was not happy with the word categories. And so after 45 minutes of this interesting experience, and I don't tend to be shy and I don't tend to get stuck on slides, but this is when Felipe said, hey, by the way, you can tell the story of categories that you have from this different lens. And this actually became the beginning of the 2019 SMJ, right? So one of the things you're hoping that will come out of your presentations, and again, you should present whatever, is one, you can figure out how many papers you have, and you're hoping that somebody will give you a framing that resonates with the management journals. And you can start by writing that paper, right? And this is kind of another nugget of wisdom that I got from Catherine Klein, who has been my mentor at Wharton. And she said to me, and this was very difficult for me to understand, because I would have these like fabulous theoretical intros, and the management people would be super interested in those. And then the minute I said the word mortgage-backed securities, people's eyes would just glaze over. Nobody had any interest in this finance, minutia, arcane stuff. And so I think if you want to publish in a management journal, the key thing to understand is you have to make your findings interesting to people who do not care about the context at all, right? And I think for historians, this is so hard to imagine, right? Like you've just invested a decade of your life in the archives, learning about X. And like in my case, the X was mortgage-backed securities. In Rohin's case, it's the Manhattan Project. And to be told that people don't care about this context is shocking. Um, but that is a level you need to get to, right? And my final piece of advice that I kind of live by is you need to publish in the journals that allow you to do your best work, which for me has been publishing in the history journals, right? And I just want to be clear about why again, not everybody feels that this is an essential, but for me, publishing in history journals has been very developmental because it allows you to get feedback from people who care about the context, who may know things about the context that you don't, right? Second, by publishing in the history journals, you make your findings public to people who may have a different lens, right? And I think some of the best papers in management, for instance, one of my favorites is Andy Hogan's paper on Edison, right? But I can think of others. Take books, take historical books, and find this management lens through that work, right? So I think that's very important. And I think you cannot underestimate the value of building community, right? Because I think, and this is why I appreciate the work Stephanie has done and the work Nick and Anna are doing at the British Academy of Management, right? We need a community that can then go to the journals and say, hey, not just in history journals, business history matters, but in management journals and say, who are your editors who are capable of evaluating, of developing this work in history, right? And again, I want to distinguish this from publishing in management journals, right? For me, the goal of publishing in management journals is the potential of reaching a broader audience, right? Like it really bothers me that mortgage-backed securities have these negative consequences, right? But if only 4 people read my work, if only 5 people read my work, that doesn't necessarily have the impact that I would like to have, you know. And I think one of the fun things of publishing in management journals is finding new ways of thinking about your findings, right? That you probably lenses that you haven't taken, ways that you haven't done things in, right? And I think the kind of the final stage, right? And Stephanie, in her review of this paper, talks about the importance of having a theoretical puzzle, right? Identifying this gap. And for me, getting this paper over the line was not just writing clearly about and explaining a theoretical puzzle, which was important, but also be achieving this clarity in the description of the methods, right? That the management audience would find convincing. And I think the methods piece, and this is why I appreciate work that Stephanie and Dan Wadhwani and Marcello Buccelli and many others have done over the past decade and a half or so, is building the language to describe our methods to the management audience, right? And which also is kind of interesting in helping us talk to other historians, right? Like when we invoke something like analytical narratives, what does that mean? So if I were to summarize my journey, right? If you want to publish in management journals, the thing you absolutely need to know is that editors matter, right? Some editors, like Connie Helfet, who has been an amazing person who developed not just people doing historical work, but she's just an amazing developmental editor. I call her the matriarch of strategy as a field, right? Or you could have an editor who, through their training, so Rohin can talk a little bit maybe about his experience with working with Hilo Lifshitz, right? Who are open to historical work, right? Maybe they're qualitative, maybe they're quantitative. So finding an editor who cares about your story is very important, whether you're writing history or something else, right? The second thing I learned is you can make your own template. And in fact, one of the lovely rejections I've gotten from org science on a different paper advised me to use my 2019 SMJ as a paper, which was interesting. And I think for me, the big takeaway of my journey is, life is too short. You need to have fun. And I think co-authoring is fun, right? And if you are not doing that already, I highly recommend it. And that's what I have in way of content I've prepared. So I'm looking forward to Ellie's discussion and the questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Maybe if you could take your sharing off, and I'm gonna just so everybody knows, I'm gonna stop the recording. So